Welcome back. In this lecture, we will examine the economics of global pandemics by considering their universal implications. In other words, you should understand that a disease outbreak in one small corner of the globe can often have major effects far beyond its own borders. So we will use the 2008 Sars outbreak in China to illustrate that point. And while the final numbers of the 2014-2015 Ebola virus pandemic are still being tallied, we will consider the initial economic impact of Ebola on one tiny nation. So what is a pandemic? I'll let you think about that for a few seconds. Remember, we defined the term way back in Section 2. Okay, a pandemic is an outbreak of disease, an epidemic that spreads to affect many people over a large region, that is, multiple countries, multiple continents, and even worldwide. Each year, some 2.3 billion human infections occur in developing countries by zoonotic diseases. Now, zoonotic diseases are those caused by animal-borne pathogens. So there's no reason to believe that pathogens with pandemic potential will not continue to emerge throughout the remainder of the 21st century in spite of our technologically advanced global society. Many of those pathogens of concern you are already familiar with from this course, like smallpox, H5N1 avian flu, HIV/AIDS, and of course Ebola virus and Ebola virus disease. Others you know at least by name from recent news accounts, for example swine flu, Sars or severe acute respiratory syndrome, and MERS or Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome or camel flu. In 2008, the World Bank estimated that a severe flu pandemic could result in $3 trillion in global economic losses, equivalent to 4.8% of the world's gross domestic product, or GDP. Most of the losses would not be caused by disease directly, but rather by consumer reactions, labor shortages, and failures in global economic and financial sectors. Of course, the most profound effects are experienced by the poor, who tend to live in communities with inadequate veterinary and human public health services. Pandemics effectively make their marks by diminishing livelihoods, nutrition, food security, trade, and the less than modest assets of poor households and communities. Recall that the World Health Organization declared the 2014 Ebola virus disease pandemic in West Africa to be an international public health emergency. WHO Director General Dr. Margaret Chan further announced that countries affected to date simply do not have the capacity to manage an outbreak of this size and complexity on their own. She went on to say, "I urge the international community to provide the support on the most urgent basis possible." Now, as we have seen in this course, local epidemics are not bound to remain local, and the international community really must be prepared to provide support beyond borders in order to keep all citizens healthy and safe. So increasing global pandemic prevention and preparedness then is essential in the 21st century, and even more so given the ease with which individuals may travel between communities, countries, and continents, potentially carrying deadly and infectious pathogens with them. After all, the adage, "it really is a small world," has never been more poignant than it is right now. So pandemic prevention requires health systems with strong core public health functionality to detect contagions early, ensure correct diagnoses, and respond rapidly to stop the contagions from spreading. But the logistics of pandemic prevention does not come with a shallow price tag. In fact, the World Bank has estimated the cost of this essential permanent global infrastructure at $3.4 billion per year in all developing countries. But just how far-reaching might the consequences of any pandemic be? So let's look at that with just one example to illustrate the point. First, a disclaimer here. Now, we have already considered the human cost of Ebola virus disease. So this lecture necessarily focuses on the international economic costs of a global pandemic. Please understand, no insensitivity to the greater human cost is intended. Now, whenever a pandemic occurs, affected governments must enlist the services of doctors and other healthcare providers, hospitals and other healthcare facilities, and pharmaceuticals, just to name a few. All of these things are quite costly for sure. However, while these expenses may be obvious to most, they are not the only expenses, and while doctors, hospitals, and drugs are localized, the economics of pandemics are much more far-reaching. In 2003, the Sars, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome outbreak, began in southern China. Now, this outbreak would last about 7 months. Because of much warranted fears of contracting SARS, international travel was severely curtailed. In fact, airlines servicing the Asian Pacific region saw about a $6 billion revenue loss, while airlines servicing North America lost another $1 billion. Tourism around the world suffered as well. In fact, hotel and gambling enterprises as far away from ground zero, that is China, as Las Vegas, Nevada, USA, experienced as much as a 50% revenue reduction in the second half of 2003. This was due to high-stakes Asian players staying home rather than risking infection with SARS. Many other businesses in the United States, that is, those dependent upon traveling sales forces, experienced drastic reductions of customer contact, which ultimately translates into sales, as sales agents were grounded and thus hindered from visiting their Asian clientele. So the less than obvious costs of pandemics place additional burden on the global economy. Dr. Dennis Carroll, director of the United States Agency for International Development's Programs on New and Emerging Disease Threats, said this, quote, "The biggest driver of the economics of pandemics is not mortality or morbidity, but risk aversion as people change their behavior to reduce their chance of exposure," end quote. So, for example, consumers will stay home rather than go to malls to shop or restaurants to dine or theaters and sporting events for fear of disease exposure. Workers will call in sick or use their accrued vacation time to avoid potential exposure, thereby affecting production. And because consumers are not buying and workers are not working, manufacturers slow production as demand for goods goes down. And if schools close during the height of the pandemic, parents lacking child care will not report to work, again negatively impacting the workflow. Now at ground zero, bars, discos, movie theaters, sports facilities, shopping malls, and hotels were all closed in Beijing. Singapore Airlines reported a 71% decrease in activity, which resulted in its putting its 6,600-member flight staff on unpaid leave. Tourism to Singapore fell 70%, while the country's GDP took a $400 million hit by the end of the year. Canada confirmed 361 cases of SARS in 2003. That number resulted in 33 deaths as the World Health Organization advised against traveling there. Canada's GDP experienced then a drop of $5 billion as a result. The SARS event of 2003 took its toll on international shipping companies like FedEx and UPS, electronics products makers, as many parts are manufactured in Asia, and even cosmetics companies which sell inventory to Asian markets. And as airlines cut back on international flights, the demand for fuel and thus the demand for oil was drastically reduced, thereby impacting oil production in Kuwait and other supplier nations. The World Bank estimated that China's SARS-related losses of $14.8 billion reduced the global GDP by $33 billion. I should note here that in spite of the obvious economic impact, China's SARS event was not a major event. The United States and Europe were largely unaffected. Only 916 people worldwide died, and the event lasted only 7 months. Now, economists have posited that a global pandemic that lasted a year or more could trigger a major global recession. For example, an event as severe as the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919 would cut the world's economic output by 4.8% and cost more than $3 trillion. So the majority of economic losses would come not from sickness or death, but from what the World Bank calls efforts to avoid infection, reducing air travel, avoiding travel to infected destinations, and reducing consumption of services such as restaurant dining, tourism, mass transport, and non-essential retail shopping. Finally, as we near the end of this lecture, this section, and this course, let us consider the economic impact on just one of the 3 countries to be hardest hit by the Ebola pandemic of 2014-2015, namely Liberia. Liberia was experiencing 8% annual growth in the years prior to 2014. Mining, agriculture, and service industries had all found firm footing in the tiny West African nation. Post-Ebola, however, annual growth is down to 3.5%. According to Liberia's Minister of Finance, Amara Kone, that decline is due mainly to the evacuation of foreign workers, closing of borders, and suspension of international flights. Agricultural areas are under quarantine, palm oil production is down due to reduction in exports, and exports of rubber and iron ore have been severely curtailed or stopped altogether. And according to Kone, the $30 million annual revenue loss is significant for the tiny nation, even in light of international assistance. Now, our final text lecture will review the information covered in this section and help prepare you for your final exam. So, as always, good luck on your final, and I'll see you in the bonus section.